Hi there, it's Marcus again. This is the week 5 lecture looking at the thinking around the future sense of foresight. And it's been, as always, a lot of fun putting it together. And for me, the challenge was actually condensing it rather than just keep on putting more and more stuff in. So we've got layers of material, some from, I guess, really highly regarded seminal futurists like Jim Data and Wendell Bell. There's quite a bit of stuff from the work I did with Richard Slaughter, and there are also some nice little segues into the work of consulting futurists who produce their own books, which will appear later in the lecture, just touching on some insights into feeling the future, and also with thinking about foresight particularly from an applied practical and strategic perspective. So I hope you have fun, but I'm just going to leap now straight into the PowerPoint and the lecture, and we will unpack it obviously as in our workshops. So here we go. So beautiful picture of an eye. I want to quickly segue though to Wendell Bell, who died a few years ago in his very late 90s. He was a sociologist who engaged deeply with futures thinking from the 70s, perhaps even 60s, through to just before his death, really, which was I'm pretty sure was like 2022 or something like that. Anyway, let's just look at what he's got to say. So first of all, he frames futurist work. Okay, the major purpose of futurists is to maintain or improve the welfare of humankind and the life-sustaining capacities of the Earth itself. So he's linking, obviously, planetary health with human health and well-being. Futurists distinctively carry out their purpose by systematically exploring alternative futures. Okay, and that's, of course, key to foresight. They engage in what he's calling prospective thinking. And the prospective thinking is actually a deeply European term. It's linked very much to the French people like Bertrand de Juvenal and Fred Pollack and people like that, Michel Godet. So there's a whole corpus of work that you might want to rush off and start exploring. And of course, Wendell Bell is one of those guys that sooner or later, when I get my act together, I'm going to put into the bookshelf series of reflections about their works. Anyway, let's keep moving. I really like this next section, this next statement, and both of them come from page 9 of this paper that he wrote. The possible, the probable, and the preferable, you've heard them before. These are what futurists seek to know. And then he gives them a gloss. What can be, what might be, and from a moral and ethical perspective, what ought to be. And I think that's really important to understand, that those are elements in good foresight work. Now, you can't escape images of the future. We touched on them in the future sense of memory. They're very relevant for the future sense of foresight, because foresight is built around images of the future. So what does Bell have to say? Images of the future inform and shape individual and group action. Although the past may constrain the present, images of the future help cause the present too. In other words, they actually shape the present, both because images mold crucial present acts and because such acts importantly create the coming present of time's future. Now, especially for you if it's English as a second language, that's a little bit tortured perhaps, but he's saying, look, images mold the present. The presents that we're living in today are based on images that were seeded decades ago, particularly through industrial and bureaucratic and democratic systems of education and so on. And because such acts importantly create images of time's future. In other words, we project them into the future. This is what I think of as the ruins of the future, right? You've read about that already. So the future is not as empty as one might assume. because it is colonized by images. Images of violence and decline, images of technological utopian, images of, a rewilded world, and so on. All of these images are pulling and tugging and in fact competing for our attention. I make this point in one of my papers on anticipatory aesthetics. Images are aesthetic touchstones in which the past connects to the present and informs future possibilities. So what can we say? Well, sight is foresight, of course, as a cultural metaphor is important. So we have foresight, we have hindsight, and we have insight. They actually all go together and fall into various forms of narrative construction. Foresight is a social as well as a personal faculty that we deploy to understand the world around us, to sense make and to wayfind. Hindsight is where we look over our shoulder at, let's say, the collapse of the USSR, or at the last set of elections for our own country, and go, if only we had known, or I should have known, or whatever. That's hindsight at work. So it's an explanatory device for making sense of the past, because the past is past, and we have a lot of material or evidence around that past, especially recent past. Often what gets overlooked, of course, and you know me well enough by now, insight is really important. In other words, the ability to reflect upon our own cognitive structures, the feelings we have about the future and the past and the present, the sense we have of awareness of our own cognitive and emotional states and so on. How do we rationalize? When are we being irrational? When are we being purposefully, satirical about the world around us, making jokes about Trump or, whatever the disasters that are happening in the world? Or when are we being overly melodramatic? But also, where should we really place our attention? And what is it that shapes our ability to place or not place or misplace attention? All of those things are working. So insight is the self-knowledge that a futurist needs to cultivate in order to be a more effective futurist. So that's important. All right. From the book that I did with Richard Slaughter, we get this image. It was done by one of Richard Slaughter's friends. The guy's name is on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I like it because it's about memory and foresight, and it tells a story. It tells a really nice story. You've got hindsight, which I was talking about there, and there are certain tools that help us understand the past. Of course, there's history, but there's sociology and law and politics and so on. So you've got a little car or bicycle, this tricycle, that's heading towards a precipice, a cliff, that business as usual is the pathway to the cliff if we don't change things. Future visioning, of course, is there, and they've got design and art and so on being referenced. We've got the present, which is critical and epistemological future studies right above the image, and then we've got the attractor, the images and visions of the future there. So I think it's just a beautiful way to represent the various factors that are shaping our capacity to engage in useful foresight. So I want to now focus on something else, and this is me being typically me in one sense, because I don't just turn to some current person. I go back hundreds of years. So I want to say, look, there's a place for the speculative, and of course we can speculate within a space that I call robust ignorance. And I'm going to quote a paper on the rationality of mystery that I wrote with my friend Miriam Sarnam some years ago. The paper, of course, is available on the Bubble Up page and so on. So it's all there for you. But I turned to Nicholas of Cusa, who was a Renaissance Neoplatonist philosopher and churchman. He was a clergyman, who wrote a really interesting book on ignorance and learned ignorance. And he's basically talking about the power of not knowing, and that human beings can't know. And of course, he's referring often to the sense of, we can't know the mind of God, because of course he's deeply enmeshed in a 15th century Christian world. But he makes this point, and I really like it. Since the natural desire in us for knowledge is not without purpose, the immediate object is our own ignorance. If we can fully realize this desire, for knowledge in relation to ignorance, we will acquire what he calls learned ignorance. And I riff off that by taking you to an interesting talk by Jane McDonnell, who gave this, it's a TEDx talk, and this is one of the slides she used, which I just kidnapped, as you can tell by the way it's captured there. Virginia Woolf, the future is dark, which is the best thing that the future can be, I think. So Virginia Woolf makes that point. It's not dark because the end of the world is nigh. It's dark because it's hard to penetrate. It's hard to see very far into the future, of course. Too many unexpected potential things are there. This is a good thing, and that's what Jane McDonnell is arguing. She's a really articulate person who works for the Institute for Future Thinking, and I would recommend you go and have a listen to it. This is an active link. You can see it there pop up as I put the cursor on the slide. So this is the point that Virginia Woolf makes, riffing off good old Nicholas of Cusa, who was writing it. He published that book in 1440, so that's quite a while ago. Now, turning to my own little paper with Miriam Sarnum on the rationality of mystery, I'll make this point. One is required to be bold to chart new pathways into multiple futures. How does one do that when the future can't be read? Well, plans are needed. Yeah, we need to make plans about the future. We also need ideas, the ideas that I'm presenting you here, but also any ideas you've come across that are useful in your life. And one also needs to scout, okay? That's why we've got a scout on the rock there. Scouts to run ahead and explore possibilities. I would argue that good futurists play the role of scouts, and we're often scouting out possibilities and then taking back this information to others. But we're also acting as scouts in the other sense, where a scout will lead a group of people. Those are the people who have the, let's say, the inside experience on a working of an organization or a situation. They could be climate scientists, or they could be a group of mothers with very young children who are all growing and experiencing that stuff, and you lead them into thinking of how do you want to educate your child? How do you want to bring it up? What kind of family life culture do you want? And they're the people with the knowledge. You as a scout ask the pertinent questions and give them some direction in unpacking and making sense of this. Of course, CLA, future triangle, whatever you like, those sorts of things. So let's unpack this a bit further. So I talk about this as robust ignorance. In other words, not ignorance that paralyzes you, it's ignorance that should energize and actually generate useful spaces for reflecting on possibility. Robust ignorance reaches beyond this known unknown to an engagement with the negative space implicit to all epistemological positions. You're saying, what the hell does he mean? I mean that every time, let's say you bring in the science of physics or chemistry or history or whatever, all disciplines focus on something, which means that they don't focus on other things. So they miss the negative space is the darkness around disciplinary light. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's say in the world of history, which I inhabit a lot of the time, of course, we spend a lot of time looking at ancient artifacts and ancient texts, but we know that that many artifacts and texts are missing. There's a space there, there's a gap that we can try and fill with our imaginations perhaps, or make deductions. But then even beyond that, there are questions that you can't answer until you suddenly stumble upon a new lead, a new line of inquiry, possibly a new idea. A good example would be that historians writing and working and thinking and researching in 1920 or 1950 were focused very much on politics, on battles, wars, kings, leaders, and decisions, treaties, all that sort of stuff. Very little attention was being paid to women, the poor, children, nature, in other words, environmental history, and so on. They were spaces of negative spaces, you could say, within the intellectual position of mid-20th century historical thought. So there are unknown unknowns. Why? Because no one had thought to ask about, well, what about women or what about children? It was only over that period of time that suddenly a few people came along, often outside the discipline. A Virginia Woolf, for instance, a Jane Austen. These were people who were throwing rocks at historians for ignoring, 50% of humanity and so on. So I'll go back and I'm going to read that again. And hopefully you understand what I mean there now. So robust ignorance reaches beyond the known unknowns to an engagement with a negative space implicit in all epistemological positions. These are called the unknown unknowns. In this way, it is acknowledged that there is a revealed way, the known unknowns. We know that, I don't know, the Emperor Augustus did this, but we don't know why. That's the known unknown. And then there's the silence, the unknown unknowns. Again, what about all the women or the children or nature or whatever that surrounds that which is excluded from any dominant rationality? In other words, there are rationalities, plural. A dominant rationality silences alternatives. It focuses in a very strong way, and a way that often helps us achieve all sorts of amazing things on, let's say, managing energy as we know it. Okay? So robust ignorance brings in mystery. In other words, that for me, so much of the past is deeply engaging because it is a mystery, as a way of understanding that negative space. So that's me talking about robust ignorance, and I'm talking about it because foresight actually needs to engage robust ignorance. There's so much we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen 50 or 100 years. In fact, we even don't know what's going to happen within the next 12 months. Will something happen in American politics? Will something happen in the politics of the US, of Russia and, the Ukraine? Or what might happen with, the Israeli craziness that's going on with Gaza and so on? And it's all up for grabs. Of course, the further out we go, the more mysterious the future gets. I was sitting having a coffee this morning, looking out over a beautiful vista and contemplating the Mesopotamians, as one does, and thinking about, the fact that 5,500 to 6,000 years ago, these people were building the first cities and civilizations on the planet in what's known as the Fertile Crescent, current day Iraq mostly. And I suddenly thought to myself, my God, those people were further away from Jesus Christ than we are in terms of time. And I started thinking about, what a mystery that is, in the fact that there's no way that any contemporary of Jesus Christ could imagine the world that we inhabit, nor could they have done so 200 years ago. But at the same time, between Jesus Christ's birth, let's say he was born approximately 3 or so before the Common Era starts, and the time of, let's say, an ancient king like Gilgamesh or Sargon in Mesopotamia, there's more time elapsed between those 2 points than Christ and us. And I go, oh my God. So that's the sort of mysterious thing that I start thinking about. And then I thought to myself, well, what's it going to be like in 1,000 years? What will our planet be like 1,000 years from now? If we go back 1,000 years, we're in the world where, Europe was just a dirty cesspit of fetid, stinking cities, when you had the beautiful, clean and organized and ordered worlds of China and the Islamic caliphates and so on. Nobody looking at the world 1,000 years ago would have guessed that Europe was going to become, the imperial master of the planet 1,000 years later. So we can start thinking about that. And to me, those kinds of open speculative historical futures foresight questions are the ones that really engage my mind. And I hope they engage yours too. So, good old Jim Data, who's always good for a tap on the shoulder, he makes the following point. Foresight must also and necessarily be political, ethical, aesthetic, and a very broadly participative project. It must take the form of what Alvin Toffler and Clem Bezold called anticipatory democracy. Okay. Now, if you've gone and listened to the bookshelf, you'll have heard me, I think it was lecture 2 or talk 2, it's not really a lecture, a reflection, where I had Clem Bezold's book, Anticipatory Democracy, in my hand, and I was walking you through parts of it. Go and have a listen. The point Data is making, of course, is that foresight has dimensions or domains, and of course these are political and ethical, but I'm very happy to see 30 years ago that he also included the aesthetic, which of course is the anticipatory aesthetics that I'm on about, and very broadly it's participative, it's democratic, it involves us all. So where do we go? Well, then we need to look at images, okay? They're like, in a sense, an image is a deed. It orders perception. It's an action. It's not just a noun. It's actually a verb. And it links up with this concept of inventio, which was a concept that Giambattista Vico reflected on in the 18th century. Vico died, in 1744 or something like that. And his book, The New Science, I've got a copy that's just like this. His book, The New Science, has had a profound effect, intellectual effect, on historical thought, and particularly what we call historiography. Anyway, stop and breathe for a moment, and then I'm going to give you this quote. From me, this understanding, okay, of image's deed involves inventio, the exercise of memory, as understood by Giambattista Vico. So Vico saw memory as a threefold action, okay? And he saw memory as being inventive. In other words, he recognized that every time we recall something, we recall it with nuance, with slight differences. You know, you might remember an argument you had, and one time it will make you angry, and another time you'll be laughing, for instance. So he says, look, this exercise of memory, is understood by Vico, has three modalities. Okay, memory, when it remembers things, it just recall. Imagination, okay, when it alters or imitates them, that's the imagination of memory at work. Or invention, when it gives a new turn or puts them into proper arrangement and relationship. In other words, the memory work that informs foresight is not a given. It is something that we engage with inventively, creatively, so that we can, as I talk about in other places with creative traditionalism, we can in fact turn to our traditions, turn to our memories, personal or collective, and we can reconfigure them. Of course, part of that work is the work of historians, where we come up with new ways of reading the past in order to understand our present better, but also for people who are working with memory in order to re-engage and perhaps engage for the first time or even invent new images for the future. So I recommend that you check out Vico's book, The New Science. It's very much worth a look. And, you know, also if you go and look at this reading of mine, you'll find that I'm using Ilko Runia's work there. Runia is a historian and a psychotherapist who works in the Netherlands, and he has a very interesting approach to past and future. And he uses this concept of inventio himself in a way to say, look, people almost generate historical accounts after the fact. In other words, history happens because we act, but we often act not knowing why we're acting the way we're acting. There's no doubt that at some point in the future, Russians and Ukrainians, Israelis and Palestinians will be looking back and wondering what madness was occurring at this time that allowed these kinds of things to happen. All right? So, back to the book that Richard Slaughter and I put together 20 odd years ago. We make this point. Foresight, this is the future sense, right, we're talking about, is an invitation to remember what is yet to be. I'll say that again. Foresight is an invitation to remember what is yet to be. The future leans into our wayfinding, sending messages that we perceive as ruins of the futures out there. You can see I'm thinking this stuff way back then, okay? Ruins, wayfinding, the roads taken and not taken, both beckoning to us. All around me, the visible and invisible mingle. Much we refuse to see, as is all too messy. Yet, my yearning propels me forward. Setting habit aside, we begin to see emergence becoming an impossibility here. We are not lost, and there are friends here. Causality, okay? A leads to B, runs both ways, into our futures and into our pasts. We read it when we impose it. We respond to it. There is no present that is not full of becoming, full of messages from the futures out there. And I have a confession to make. That reference is wrong. That's from a much more recent paper that I wrote. But it's, So what can I say about that? I'll have to go and change the slide before I put it up for you. So ignore that Bussey and Slaughter bit there, page 1. That's somehow it's slipped in, which is quite amusing to me, at least. So Jim Data gives us a list of some of the things that futurists need to be good at. Wide knowledge of history, social sciences, natural sciences, and technology. Look at that wide is that knowledge of philosophy, creativity, imagination, inventio, synthetic ability, anticipatory facility, and deep curiosity. You know, these are, I've condensed these, and I will actually be scanning and putting up, making available to you the paper he wrote, because it's an absolutely excellent paper. And he goes on to say this: all of this can be described in one word, Eigelsthon, okay? And I think that's fantastic. And of course, it's classic Jim, which is nostalgia spelled backwards, okay? And he goes on like this. And I think this is awesome because this is definitely not me. This is Jim. The yearning for things to come, he says. The remembering the future without being disrespectful to the past. Preferring the dreams of the future to the experiences of the past. Always desiring to try something new. To go. Star Trek, where no one has gone before, in all areas of human and non-human and soon post-human experience. We inhabit a complex and layered field that shapes perception and meaning. Okay, and this is, yes, this is definitely, the reference is correct here. This work then builds on the integral awareness that individuals and societies they inhabit are mediated by dynamic contested fields in which external forces such as policy and technology and economics are mediated by equally powerful internal processes like ideology, worldview, desire, hope and fear. And this leads us to this 4-quadrant model that I've already talked about with you, but it's useful to see how we're using it. This is all in that book on Futures Thinking for Social Foresight. Okay, and so you've got a clear example of the interior and exterior, individual and collective 4-quadrant model, and you can see how it's folded. And to me, that's really the best way to represent the 4-quadrant model, is a folded flow between subjective, intentional, subjective, cultural, cultural, objective, social, and objective behavioral. You've got to understand that these things are flowing together. So that foresight, which I've said multiple times, is rooted in memory, but memory is not a given. It is fluid and multiple, as Vico makes it very clear, even centuries ago. So we've got something highly dynamic here to work with, and it's beautiful as a result. And so Slaughter and I go on to make these 2 points. When we engage futures literacies in anticipatory processes, we activate social foresight. So this foresight embraces the integral nature of consciousness, as in the four-quadrant model, and thus allows for individual, cultural, social, and environmental factors to come together in a set of relationships and contexts, okay, that approximate human reality. The next point is, as human projects, we are all human projects, history and futures also human projects, both rely on our ability to move out of the present and construct or reconstruct some of the main features of other times and other places. History, for instance, may appear easier to deal with because it is littered with physical evidence and thus in some ways more immediate. But the drawback is that you can't change history. It can be reinterpreted but not altered. But of course, the implication is that we can change the future because it hasn't happened yet. So there are many things that might happen that might make for alternative futures that we couldn't possibly dream of, the good and the bad. So this one is an image that Richard created probably 10 years before the book came out, but we use it in the book. That's Richard Slaughter. We can see that the brain acts as a filter here. So there are perceptions, that's the emotional, subjective processes of anxieties and concerns and fears and so on, along with the learned things, capacities, ability to analyze or extrapolate or imagine or intuit and learn. And from that we get concepts emerging, futures concepts that we've discussed already, much of this last two series of this course, methodologies and tools, how to do it, CLA, four-quadrant model, future triangle, whatever, and applications. What's the context? Is it an educational context? Is it a business context? And so on. So this brings up the question of creativity. The future invites adventure. Okay, it offers us the wide open spaces of possibility. So being a futurist is actually a lot of fun, potentially, right? It's adventurous. You're the scout, or we're the scouts out there looking. Yet, given the cultural conditioning that shapes every context, there are always limits to what can occur, to what is possible and plausible. There are risks too. Taking the future as both a principle of action, okay, and as an active space of becoming suspends the obligations of the everyday life. And that suspension of the everyday life and all its obligations is to say, okay, we're going to put aside the present and we're going to focus on the possible, okay? Because otherwise, if we think the present is given and set in stone, we are going to be stuck. So Tyler Mongan is a consultant working in the US, and he produced this lovely book called Feeling the Future. And in it he says, goals are a journey, not a destination. Go figure. Most people, I think, in our goal constructed world would say a goal is an endpoint, but no, it's the journey. And he says, when you find the feeling behind your goal, excitement or anticipation of some kind, and activate that feeling in your body, then in a real physical way, the goal has already been achieved. When you maintain that feeling in the body and the physical state associated with the goal, then it becomes easier to make the goal a reality, moving it from the mind into physical matter. So this feeling future stuff that is kind of the overarching theme for this series of lectures and workshops, this is what Tyler is on about here. He's saying, look, you've got to feel it. If we can feel enthusiasm for an alternative future that is better, more inclusive, kinder, more peaceful, whatever it is, we start to emanate possible trajectories that will change. It's an individual/collective process, okay? And he goes on to make the next point as well. Goals are not the end. They are the start of a journey deeper into the self. Goals are a realization of feelings that we have been missing in our life. I really like that. These feelings that we've been missing. It is this journey that allows the future and the future you to emerge in unexpected ways. All right. So Mongan is really telling an interesting story about the power of feeling and foresight, feeling, memory. And memory, of course, is deeply viscerally encoded into us, especially traumatic memory. But even pleasant memory is deeply cellular, and it is a feeling thing. So one question that I'd be thinking about is, how do we feel good about the future, and how do we work towards the realization of that good feeling state? Forest walks, which is what I talked about in the last 2 lectures. Going for a walk, being out in the world, feeling the body, just feeling good about moving, even if your legs are stiff and hurt like my old knee does sometimes. It's a great thing to be out there and breathing clean air in the sunshine and or the rain or the snow or whatever is happening and in the world around you. Marie Conway is another. She's an Australian futurist working in Melbourne, very focused on education particularly, but she has written this lovely little book called Foresight Infused Strategy. Okay, and she makes a number of really useful observations about foresight. So this one relates to understanding. Foresight has value because it allows us to acknowledge uncertainty and seek to better understand it, not try to explain it away with predictions. So she's prediction wary, and she goes on. So we've got to move beyond best practice, she says. Strategy doesn't help, okay? It really reinforces the present state of mind and state of play. So this isn't the realm of foresight. Strategy isn't. Foresight infused strategy is what she's arguing for, remember, and that's the name of her book. Title of the book is underneath the slide, of course. So this isn't the realm of foresight work, where mostly we do not know what we do not know. There's an echo there, isn't there? There are no right answers, and there is no accepted and unquestioned understanding of the likely impact of change shaping the future of our organisations. And she concludes, and I think this is particularly beautiful, and I think it's, it really says something about her way of thinking and feeling. For me, she says, using foresight is personal. Okay? It's changing the way you think about the future. You can read and analyse all the case studies you want. You can listen to as many lectures from Marcus as possible or follow best practice. But unless your foresight switch is turned on, you are applying conventional thinking, not the imaginative, not the inventio, whatever you want to call it, to the future. And that won't help you craft future's ready strategy. Take a deep breath. Last 2 slides. A long quote from me, but it's a good one, I have to say. Foresight as a sense-making tool. So to sort of sum up the future's sense of foresight, this is something that I was thinking a few years ago, and I really think it is a useful way of tying things together. Foresight as a sensory expression places the human actor, you and me, in the context as co-creator. In this, risk and opportunity are described, as I've described above, become key elements in a sense-making that is wholeheartedly future-oriented. Foresight anticipates and orders. These are some of the things it does. It calculates and envisions. It draws on our collective experience of the past via memory to project individuals, you and I, and communities, us and us, into the future. It works on scenarios, and when applied critically to the future, it too reduces the level of external control via conditioning and coercion. Given that our futures are colonized by past and present images of the future, a key element in liberating the foresight sense is in deploying models of the future that make explicit this colonized space. So the fact that we inhabit ruins and that these ruins extend into the future, we need to become aware of the architecture of those ruins and the way that they colonize and shape our imagination in ways that constrain action rather than liberating it. And there I'm thinking of people like Rob Hopkins with his book, From What Is to What If. very important question to ask and to explore and to also collect stories about. So, my conclusion. Imagination, then, is the creative deployment of socio-historical and biographical data, that's memories, in the search of meaning and new possibilities. Okay, so for me to challenge the colonized nature of futures imaginaries, that's the term, futures imaginaries, we need to liberate our imagination. We need to become imagination activists, which is what we talk about in the past couple of lectures, and of course we will return to it with a vengeance when we deal with ways in which we can apply foresight in practice. So last thought, foresight is a powerful future sense that actively engages with and develops imagination as a tool for realizing alternative futures. So there we go. So that's my thinking on foresight at this moment. I had to be very disciplined to make sure that I didn't stretch it out too long, throw too much stuff at you. There's so much stuff. There's so many books, so many ways to do it, so many ways to tell the story. But ultimately, you know, I think Marie Conway's point is a really good one, that you need to turn your foresight switch on. And if you do that, then stuff will just start happening. Okay? Thanks so much. See you all in our next session. Bye.